My Lords, I thank the Noble Lord Bridges of Henley for introducing this debate and the Economic Affairs Committee for its report, some of which I agree with, some of which I strongly disagree with. There are two themes throughout my remarks addressing two key elements of the committee's report: the lack of intellectual diversity in the bank and its climate remit. But I must first begin by noting the lack of diversity in your Lordship's House discussions today. I would love to see more Noble Lords who focus on poverty, on workers' rights, on the environment, on the place of small and medium-sized enterprises and regional economies in debates such as this. There has been a high degree of groupthink in our debate today. That's true, of course, across our politics and the lack of democracy across all of our structures. And I acknowledge that I'm addressing these remarks to Lords who are not in this chamber rather than Lords who are here at this moment and speaking. But I do want to address the committee directly, because I took a careful look at the list of those who gave testimony to it. One name stuck out, Positive Money, on whose works my remark draw today. But other than that, I find it curious that no name that leapt out to me was a climate expert or a climate finance expert. There's no reference I found to the committee consulting our own Environment and Climate Change Committee. I respectfully put to the committee that in future, if it's going to comment on climate issues, make it a central part of its report, it might want to focus on more diverse testimony. But that, of course, is in the intellectual context in which debate on the Bank of England is highly siloified. I've just made up a word. If we look at a great deal of commentary around the actions of the bank in 2021 and 2022, the criticism we've heard very often today is that as inflation reached its peak, the bank was too slow to act. But interest rate rises can't address the main driver of the inflation we've seen, and that is the dependence of our economy on highly volatilely priced fossil fuels. Much of the criticism, some of what we've heard today, has been based on the flawed theory that inflation has been due to a wage price spiral. And it's too often ignored the fact that rate hikes have highly unequal impacts. They attempt to bring down inflation by reducing the spending. The poorest and the most indebted are most affected, while the incomes of those with savings and the profits of the banking sector are increased. And crucially, in the climate context, the rate rises have added to the downside of the investments that we desperately need, because many green projects require a large amount of upfront investment, despite the fact that we will all profit from the cheaper prices of the energy generation, of the reductions in bills from insulation, etc. And of course, we live in a society of crumbling infrastructure, housing, roads, literally, and many other issues. Now, the commentary of the Lords Committee, with which I respectfully disagree, suggests that giving the Monetary Policy Committee and the Policy Committee a remit on climate change risks drawing the bank into the government's wider policy agenda and jeopardises the bank's ability to prioritise price and financial stability. Now, I think it's worth going back to the history of this. It's a demonstration that campaigning works, that in 2021, when the government's target of reaching net zero was included in the government's letters to all key policy-making committees for the first time, it was a step signalling the government's support for ambitious action to steer the financial flows away from harmful sources like fossil fuels and towards green and sustainable industries. Now, of course, critics will say, and I would entirely agree, that central bank policies alone are no silver bullet for environmental crises. But central banks do have a central role. Think of those core priorities, objectives of price and financial stability. There is no stability on a dying planet. The economy is a complete subset of the environment, utterly 100% dependent on it, not on complex equations unattached to the real world, or assumptions that all resources are either infinite or replaceable. No, they are not. The practical reality is the UK financial sector continues to pour money into new fossil fuels, despite the reality of the carbon bubble, the huge financial risk that represents, while relying on climate risk models that fundamentally do not accurately translate into the complexity of the financial risk. And that's only looking at climate. I would also point to the fact that the bank needs to look more widely at all of the other planetary boundaries that we've exceeded. We're seeing a great deal of focus at the moment on novel entities, pesticides, pharmaceuticals and plastics, and there's huge financial risks in that area as well. To put this in a broader frame, the UK financial and economic system remains highly vulnerable to fossil inflation, while at the same time the impacts of the climate change, such as on our food supply, are already causing climate inflation. I'm just about to coin another word, which is shockflation. We are in an age of shocks. The geopolitics are very obviously extremely unstable, and all of these things have to be considered in the round, rather than simply looking at the economy as a set of equations sitting somehow outside this. There's also the fact that we have too much finance, too much money going into the financial sector rather than the real economy, just as most of the money from quantitative easing went into raising inequality, making the few richer and the rest of us poorer, much as it was needed, at least at the start, to tackle the chaos created by the greed and fraud of the bankers. The bank and the Treasury and the government are far too dependent on failed, outdated models and mathematical equations that bear no resemblance to the real world. Now, I want to move very specifically to the present day and refer to the open letter dated March 16, referring to the remarks made by the Governor of the Bank of England to the Lords Economic Affairs Committee that the bank has reduced its resourcing for the climate emergency work, to which the Noble Baroness Lady Lane Fox has referred. The timing of these remarks, this action, could not be worse in a world that's on fire, that's awash, that's melting. So I have a direct question to the Noble Lady the Minister and indeed to the Labor front bench. Will it support the calls by so many eminent economists, and I have to declare an interest that the Green Party's spokesperson Molly Scott-Cato was among the signatories to that letter, will they support the call from that letter to reprioritise work in the bank to align the financial sector with the government's climate goals, reversing the resource cuts, and to reassert the Bank of England as a climate leader as a matter of urgency? Now, I want to briefly address the issue of the intellectual diversity of the bank. It is not independent of failed ideology and a discipline that's simply run out of road. During the 2016 Brexit referendum campaign, I suggested to my now House colleague, Lord Cameron, that the Remain campaign should stop saying economists say, because no one believes them, and that's even more of the case now. Neoclassical economics is the absolute opposite of systemic thinking. We need systematic, scientific, sociologically, politically literate thinking in the bank, the Treasury, and across government. We are in the age of post-growth. Not only can we not have infinite growth on a finite planet, we are not going to have growth in at least the coming decade. To quote the IMF chief, the tepid 20s are with us. So, diversity. They're not going to thank me for this, but I'm going to suggest some names that the Bank of England should start drawing on. Jason Hickel, Kate Raworth, Julia Steinberger, Anne Pettifor, Tim Jackson, Judith Curtin-Darling. All of them spoke at the post-growth conference in the European Parliament last year that was backed by all but the far-right group there. I'll hazard a prediction that there were several future economics laureates speaking there, an original thinking that is lacking in what is regarded as the economic mainstream. And very quickly, I'm going to raise one final issue with the Noble Lady the Minister, drawing on the work of the New Economics Foundation. The government could save £55 billion over the next 5 years if it limits the amount of money the Bank of England pays on interest to the commercial banks. It will pay over £150 billion to the Bank of England, the Treasury, to fund its payments to the banking sector by 2028, on top of the £30 billion already paid out in 2023. Surely this is something that other countries are not doing that we didn't do in the past that we can reverse.